It's the first word I learned in Australia because that's what the French say. Oh, yes.
I swear in my name.
It's more than enough. Two fishers, fins, and fish feathers.
Starting a fight?
This kid,
I don't know what's back
yeah.
And I'm like, why are you all here? I'm confused.
I will say that one nice thing about coming to San Jose was very marine oriented. They're very interested in things that are not just their system. I'm sure.
I mean, I'm better in that than I did last year because I've been running a lot. But once I run distance in soccer, it's like straight sprints. So it's like, it helps, but it's still different enough where
It's
it's still good.
people have those interests as well.
Is Katie coming?
Yeah. Something they know not. Yeah. I'm just they were like that. Throw you both out of the game. What the hell did I do? Big pattern. They claim I misread and they never told me that, but I didn't know. So I'm like, it was either the rep. I think it was the rep relaying the message of where the person is, and I think he misheard her and said that to her. She didn't say that. She said it clear. Maybe so. Which is the same for this guy.
It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pam Michael, the PhD today. She is a postdoc in the South Carolina Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, headed up by Dr. Patrick Jodas and Dr. Beth Ross, who are both absent, which is why I get to introduce her. She's originally from Washington State, and she did her undergrad work at the University of Puget Sound with Dr. Peter Hodem, who is someone who I've met before at conferences, a really great guy, really admire. And then she did her master's work in Hawaii, studying albatross in Central California and how they're interacting with the national marine sanctuaries in that area. And then she did her PhD work at the University of Tasmania, looking at albatross and longline vessel interactions, which is, I believe, what she's presenting on today. We're really excited to have her here. She's been a great asset in the lab so far. She's very quantitative, so she has lots of skills. I first became kind of interested in her work a bit ago when I found some papers that she had published online about vessel interactions, and they kind of play into what I'm doing as well. So I'm really excited to have her here and finally have another Seabird person in the department. So with that, Dr. Pam Michael.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I've only been here for about a month, and everyone I've met has been incredibly kind and helpful. I really look forward to getting to meet more of you and to becoming more a part of this research community. I'm really honored to be able to participate in this kind of a collaborative environment. But for now, let me tell you a little bit about some of my PhD work, looking at fishers, fins, and feathers, the spatial ecology in the Southern Indian Ocean. The work I'm going to talk about today involves characterizing the use of space and the interactions between fish and fishers, as well as fishers and albatross, to better understand some of the likely historical drivers of their spatial and demographic patterns. Today I'm going to talk about 3 different research sections. The first will involve describing how my co-authors and I have characterized the distribution of fishing effort, or fishing effort patterns, at a relatively broad scale. We'll then use that information to develop fleet dynamics models. The models that we develop look at the catch per unit effort of different tuna species, they consider the value and the costs of different fishing areas, and then they look at how all those terms are associated with the observed distribution of effort. This helps us to identify the factors that fishers appeared to seek or avoid when determining where to fish and how much effort to deploy. From there, we're going to switch gears and look at albatross population dynamics. Specifically, we'll be looking at the dynamics of a population of black-browed albatross that breed on Kerguelen Island in the southern Indian Ocean. When looking at their dynamics, we'll consider the interactions with the environment as well as fishing effort, and that will be through bycatch, and with bycatch being the unintentional killing of non-target species, in this case albatross, which can be hooked during fishing activities if they forage on some of the bait or if they interact with a fishing line and become injured. To help everyone kind of mentally adjust to the southern Indian Ocean, this is a map of the broader Southern Ocean. I worked really hard to create this map, by the way, on Google Earth. And there's Australia to our east, or to the east, and to the west is Madagascar, Mozambique, and South Africa. And to the south, we just have Antarctica. This giant red trapezoid represents the study area, which is from about 20 degrees south to 50 degrees south. And then this red arrow points to the island of Kerguelen, which is part of the French southern and Antarctic lands. This region encompasses a lot of different environmental zones within the ocean. It's mainly temperate and subtropical environments, but it also includes some tropical influences at the northern boundary, and the southern boundary does include some Antarctic influences as the polar front goes through that region. I'm going to start now to describe some of what we've looked at regarding our fishing effort patterns. And I want to acknowledge up front the very valuable feedback that I received from the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, who gave us access to their data, which are publicly available. They were very helpful in the guidance of the appropriate use of their data. So in this section, as well as the next on fleet dynamics, I'm going to be talking about industrial pelagic longline fishing effort and their fleets. Many different nations or flag states participate in this type of a fishery. Key aspects to this fishery are the presence of a main line, which is an incredibly long line, which is from tens to hundreds of meters in length. From this line are branch lines, which are smaller lines with baited hooks attached, and these baited hooks extend the length of the main line, so therefore there are thousands of baited hooks with each gear setting. The depth of fishing can be adjusted. For the pelagic fishery, they fish mainly in the top to mid layers of the ocean, but this is still, it can be hundreds of meters deep that they have their hooks. And the depth is adjustable by the placing of the fishing floats, as well as how many branch lines occur between the floats. These fleets also have a lot of tools at their disposal to mitigate or reduce bycatch interactions. I've chosen to highlight one particular type, which is shown by those squiggly red lines, called streamers or Tory lines. Those streamers essentially act as a deterrent for albatross that might otherwise interact with hooks as they're sitting on the surface with bait in them before they actually sink to a depth that albatross can't access them. The two fleets that we're going to focus on are the Japanese on top and Taiwanese on the bottom. Can I have a pelagic longline fleets? Ooh, there we go. The size of the circle indicates the magnitude of effort, where a larger circle indicates a greater magnitude of effort. All of the data we're looking at are from the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, which again are publicly available data, available at a 5x5 longitude by latitude spatial resolution and a monthly temporal resolution. These fleets target mainly tunas, and they're important contributors to the global sashimi market. Now, the sashimi market sells very high-grade products that generally end up that are for sushi quite often. And a vessel that's active in either one of these fleets tends to have very long trips at sea before it returns to port for any notable amount of time. They can spend from 18 to 24 months at sea in a single trip. We wanted to look at the magnitude of effort over time for these fleets. So here we can see that there's a lot of variation between the two fleets. The Japanese fleet in red started fishing in this region around the 1950s, whereas the Taiwanese fleet began in the 1960s. So they've been around for a relatively long time. And we also wanted to look at the spatial distribution of these fleets, but in a more general sense, as opposed to looking at all the 5x5 grids. So we calculated the average latitude of fishing effort. This describes the relative poleward or equatorward distribution of fishing effort. We again see a lot of variation, particularly with the Japanese fleet. It's likely that this rapid increase in the poleward or rapid poleward movement of the Japanese fleet reflects the discovery of southern bluefin tuna. These are a very valuable species, and it opened up an important market that was previously unknown. However, this reduction in poleward effort in the mid-1980s likely reflects a rationalization when fuel prices were increasing and they needed to kind of reduce overall money that was going into the fleet in order to keep it economically viable and beneficial. So, in looking at, after having looked at effort at a broad scale in time and space, we started wondering what are the more recent patterns in fishing effort, the more recent history, and also what's happening at a monthly scale, because annual is a little bit coarse. So that led us to model the magnitude and distribution in terms of that average latitude for both of these fleets. We did this using generalized additive models. They allow for a very flexible relationship to be defined with a variable. And we wanted to look at a range of variables that could represent different scales that effort might be associated with, different scales of time and space. So we looked at the possible relationship with a simulated seasonal cycle, which is a very regular pattern of increase and decrease. We also looked at or included sea surface temperature bands and their locations to see if fishers were apparently tracking local scale environments. Then we looked at sea ice extent, which is a bit of a remote association, but still relevant at a regional scale. And lastly, we considered some climate indices. Climate indices describe broad-scale patterns across ocean basins and sometimes beyond, which have natural cycles that can range between a couple of years to multiple decades. We combined all of these variables in a single model and progressively removed the least significant variable and remodeled, and then we repeated that process until the least significant variable related to 5% or greater of the null deviance explained. We thought that this was too much of a loss of an association with a fishing effort, so our final model retained that weakest variable relating to at least 5% of the deviance, as well as all stronger variables. Following this approach, we found that season was the variable included in the vast majority of the models. Actually, it was included in all but one of the models we did, and it was often the most significant variable. We found that seasonal changes in effort also coincided with the movements of tunas into and out of the region. We gained tuna movement information from the literature. Tunas need to spawn in warmer temperature waters, so when they're spawning, their access to the spawning species is either reduced or essentially negligible in the region, depending on their temperature preference. We also found some coincidence of seasonal changes in effort and management timeframes, particularly the beginning of the southern bluefin tuna quota year, so when fishers could begin fishing again for this very valuable species. I'm going to run through one of our models as an example and show you how we've interpreted it based on the variables retained in the model and their relationship with effort. The fleet we're going to look at, or the fleet and model we're going to look at, is the Taiwanese fleet and their magnitude of effort model. Here the solid line indicates the observed data, where the dashed line indicates the model. This red box shows the data that were excluded from the original modeling process, and then we later use those data to assess the model's short-term predictive capabilities. we found that this model performed quite well. And when we looked at those seasonal associations of effort and the variables retained, we identified that during the winter, it was the greatest period of, that's when the greatest effort occurred, and this also coincided with the presence of large adult albacore, as this is outside of their spawning period. Albacore are known to be an important target species for this fleet, so we suggest that they may have been targeted heavily during this time. However, in the spring and summer, these albacore are spawning, therefore less accessible to fishers within the region. The remaining fishers that were fishing still, we suggest we're targeting other species that were available, including big-eye tunas. When we consider our models as a whole, we found a lot of these seasonal target species implications, and this suggested to us that seasonal changes in the magnitude distribution of effort might relate to shifting target species depending upon what's available in the region. And I didn't highlight it here, but we'll see it in just a second. We also noted important regional variation in our results. Therefore, in the next modeling phase, we wanted to be a bit more explicit about the way we addressed space, and we also wanted to further investigate this possibility for target species. This brings us to our fleet dynamics modeling section. So why are we looking at fleet dynamics? Because humans are often the most manageable part of the system. There are many benefits to increasing our understanding of fleet dynamics. For example, we can better understand our own behavior and our own motivations and why we're interacting with the environment. This will help us better anticipate fisher response to change. Now, this could be change within the environment or change that occurs through management. Understanding that would allow us to better assess potential management options and the implications of different management actions. And lastly, it's also an important part of ecosystem-based management, which I've abbreviated as EBM here, because understanding how fishers interact with the fish and the other parts of the environment will help us understand how these interactions can play throughout the system as a whole. The majority of current approaches to modeling fleet dynamics use discrete choice, random utility, or agent-based models. These can be highly informative models, and they often assume maximum efficiency, but they also require very high resolution data. This includes information on the behavior of individual vessels, as well as detailed economic information. This table here, which is from a really neat fleet dynamics study, highlights the resolution of the data that was needed for this modeling application, where you have trip length of a particular trip and the number of days, as well as the distance between each successive gear setting in nautical miles. The reliance on these methods, which require this type of high-resolution data, has resulted in the majority of fleet dynamics models being applied to fleets that are within national boundaries or that make relatively short trips out to sea. Therefore, we suggest that alternative approaches are needed to address the fleet model potential for other fleets. And this includes the fleets that we're looking at, the Japanese and Taiwanese pelagic longline fleets. We think that these are excellent candidates for investigating a fleet dynamics modeling approach for coarse resolution data, because these fleets fish in the same area, they use the same gear type, they target approximately the same species. However, they have very unique distributions of fishing effort in space. These plots are the mean number of hooks, where red colors indicate a high magnitude, blue a low magnitude, and white an absence of observed effort within the study period. We can see that the Japanese fleet has very distinct east-west components to their fishing effort, whereas the Taiwanese fleet's more present in the central portion. Now, we know that effort varies with time. We learned that in the previous section. It's suggested that this could relate to target species. We suggest that. We can see that effort is regionally unique between these two fleets and even within a fleet. And we also do have access to coarse resolution data on catch as well as effort from those 5x5 data from the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. But what we don't have is vessel-specific information, any higher resolution data than 5x5 degrees, nor detailed economic data. With these opportunities, we moved forward to develop the following approach. We started by gathering relevant observed data. We collected environmental data, which was namely oceanographic characteristics. We also identified the main catch species and known important target species from the literature for these fleets. This happened to be, it ended up that both fleets caught the same 4 tuna species, and they made up a significant proportion of their total catch. So we have layers on that, and we also have information on the distribution of fishing effort for both fleets. Our next step was to model the relationship of the catch per unit effort of each tuna species by location, so in space, by time, as well as by flag state, so either Japan or Taiwan, and we also looked at the association with environmental data. We used a particular type of generalized additive model, which is called a Gaussian location scale model. In addition to modeling the location of the data, which is the mean, so in our case, which is the catch per unit effort, we also looked at the scale, which relates to the variance in the data. So this model allows us to estimate both the mean and the variance of the catch per unit effort. We had those variables, and then we obtained price information on each species to describe the value based on a statistical, on a market-based reports. And we also estimated that the cost of fishing increased with increased distance from catch transfer facilities, as this is a very high value, as this tends to be a high-value fishery. Ensuring efficient transfer of catch is important to maintaining the value of the catch. We then looked at all different combinations of these variables and selected the model which related most to the historically observed pattern of fishing effort, and we call that our historical fishing or effort allocation strategy. With this new approach, we produce the following results. We have each fleet shown here. Everyone's on the same color scale. Our observed data are here for comparison, and our models on the other side. We did a pretty good job replicating that east-west sectionality of the Japanese fleet, as well as the kind of central fishing activity of the Taiwanese data. There are notable imperfections in the data, but it does a pretty good job of capturing the overall mean distribution of fishing effort. When we looked at our model coefficients, they indicated that the Japanese fleet were high-value specialists. They very heavily targeted the highest value species, and they preferentially avoided fishing in areas where there was high variability in the catch per unit effort of those high-value species. This contrasts generalists, or the Taiwanese fleet, who appeared to be more flexible generalists, as they more evenly targeted across the target species, and they were actually drawn to areas of high variability in the catch of a high-value species, but they chose to minimize their costs by minimizing distance of travel. So if you've noticed, I purposely use the terms specialists and generalists to kind of demonstrate the easy connections that you can make between human behavior and common ecological theory. So we really are animals at heart and do have motivations which can sometimes be quantified. Sorry, soapbox, I'm stepping down for the moment. So for the implications for this model, we've shown that behavior is fleet-specific. Those unique spatial distributions related to, we were able to identify unique targeting strategies for each fleet, and it's quite likely that they also have unique overlap with other species. Those species could be species they wouldn't want to interact with, or potentially valuable market species. But essentially, each fleet is a unique entity. Additionally, it's likely that their response to future conditions might differ, even if the same single change occurred within the system. The two fleets might respond in a different way. And in a more general sense, I encourage you to consider that when you're looking at your data and considering how to move forward, if the common approach isn't practical in terms of the data required, in terms of the questions you're addressing, or in terms of other logistics such as time or money, do consider reading a little bit more about your region, making sure you really understand the data that you have at hand, seeking out and listening to regional experts, particularly experts that are tangential to your field. They can sometimes help you to draw parallels that you wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to. Don't be afraid to learn something new and to possibly fail at it. And you might have the ability to, or we all have the ability to develop something that is unique and informative. So you can do it. Believe in yourselves, as I try to do this in myself. Now we're on to the third and final section, which is albatross population dynamics. And here I want to say thank you to the decades worth of field workers who contributed to the demographic data set, as well as the fisheries data contributors. This section of the analysis was involved using a lot more Indian Ocean Tuna Commission data, as well as many other organizations' data, and I really want to acknowledge how generous they were in sharing that information with us. So a little bit about albatross. Albatross are very large birds that are highly specialized and also forage across very large distances in the ocean to try to find food at the ocean's surface. They're specialized in the sense that they've developed this unique a unique method of flying called dynamic soaring, and which helps them to cover large distances. And they also have a strong sense of smell, which helps them to locate food as they cover those distances. Researchers looking at the heart rate of albatross involved in different activities and the passage of time have very elegantly quantified this extreme energetic efficiency of their dynamic soaring flight. Here we have a bird that's flying, and we can see as time passes that its heart rate approaches the level of that of a bird that's just sitting on the water. So they're actively foraging, or they're actively searching for food, but expending relatively little energy. Unfortunately, some of the unique and specialized characteristics about albatross can make them and their population susceptible to decline. One of the unique aspects of albatross life history is that they are extremely long-lived. Some species lived 40 years, other species have breeding individuals that are 60 years of age or older. They mature quite late in life, sometimes not until they're 7, 9, or 11 years old do they begin to breed. And their populations are very sensitive to slight increases in adult mortality. So just a slight change in the number of adults that die can actually lead to a population decline. And their unique ability to cover large distances and to seek out food can actually get them into trouble sometimes. They're often drawn towards fishing vessels, which could offer a free meal, but they can also offer the potential for a bycatch interaction, such as this individual is toying with here as it's trying to pull a piece of food off of a hook. So we're looking at albatross demographics and population trends, as these data can be used to inform management and serve as potential thresholds for management action. However, this gets a little bit complicated because population trends are impacted by multiple factors. For example, they can relate to demographic feedbacks, such as density dependence. There can be interactions with the environment, as well as fishing through bycatch, and fishing itself also interacts with management. Therefore, it's difficult to tell when you observe a change or even just the continuation of a trend in population data what this is really telling you about the population. Integrated population models allow us to differentiate some of the variability that's related to one factor, such as fishing effort, to that of another, such as the environment. Today I'm going to run through an example of an integrated population model applied to black-browed albatross colony breeding on Kerguelen and what we learned using this approach. Integrated population models have been used in fisheries stock assessments for quite a while and have more recently been applied to seabird populations. An integrated population, or this type of modeling approach, uses every data set available at every time step within the model. So they estimate all parameters within a single model framework. This differs from other modeling approaches, which define some relationships, such as the relationship of the environment with, say, chick survival, outside of the demographic modeling framework. This model structure that we will be looking at is based on sex, age class, and breeding stage. We're using that hopefully now familiar 5 by 5 degree spatial scale and a monthly temporal scale. The model we're using is based in a maximum likelihood framework. So the parameter values are estimated by maximizing the log likelihood of the objective function. And our objective function balances the estimation of multiple parameters, or the terms that we're looking at. And the parameters that we are estimating for this population will be virgin demographics, the impacts of density dependence, the environmental impacts on chick mortality, as well as the bycatch of 5 superfleets. Superfleets are essentially a way to aggregate individual fleets, but based on gear type and bycatch characteristics. So if 2 fleets share the same gear type and bycatch characteristics, we will combine them into a single fleet regardless of whether they're from a different flag state or country. There's a lot of different types of data that are required for this type of model. Specifically, it needs some population data. In our case, we need at-sea distribution information for the albatross. We also need to obtain relevant environmental information, as well as the distribution of fishing effort. Now, that fishing effort can be overlapped with the distribution of albatross, and to quantify the potential interactions, we also need observed bycatch rates. And these are obtained from the literature, either from reports or peer-reviewed literature. And the last thing we need to do is to use a term called the population multiplier. The population multiplier allows us to scale the observed bycatch rate to that of our focal population. We're looking at one colony of black-browed albatross, but they breed at multiple locations across the globe. And so we only want to represent the bycatch that's actually occurring in this population and not others. Now for a little bit of background on the colony or the population itself. Now Kerguelen is this beautiful little yellow triangle, and this spread of gray dots represents the at-sea distribution for this population. During the breeding period, they're very intensely aggregated near the breeding colony around that blue box. But then post-breeding, they migrate and are relatively diffusely aggregated in the red box, south of Australia, and a bit more intensely aggregated a little further to the east in that orange box. But the period of intensest aggregation at sea for these birds is definitely the breeding period. Monitoring of the number of breeding pairs at this colony has noted a bit of a decline, or quite a dramatic decline in the mid-1990s, but then this was followed by an increase in the mid-2000s. So we've applied an integrated population model to help us try to understand what was happening during this period in particular. The terms we estimated in this model include the impacts of density dependence, which we assumed to occur on chicks as well as young birds. Density dependence reflects increased competition for resources as population size grows. We also looked at the impact of or the relationship between sea surface temperature and chick mortality. We looked at 2 different periods for sea surface temperature during the breeding season. So we looked at sea surface temperature in that blue region when birds were incubating, so when they're sitting on eggs. And we also looked at the temperatures in that blue box during the rearing period when adults are actively leaving and returning to the colony to forage and provision a chick. Then we also included sea surface temperature from these non-breeding periods, each of them individually, but we looked at their relationship with the following breeding season to see essentially if that staging period ended up having some kind of a relationship with the survival of chicks. And lastly, we also estimated the number of birds killed by each of 5 superfleets. In the pelagic longline fleets, we looked at the Japanese pelagic longline fleet separated from these other pelagic longline fleets. And then shelf slope effort, or possibly associated with plateaus or other bathymetric features. We looked at trawl fishing fleets, demersal longline fishing fleets, which fish instead of the top and mid layers of the ocean, they fish the lower layers and the bottom. And lastly, we looked at very interesting illegal, unreported, and unregulated demersal longline fleet, which was occurring within the region. For the results, I'm going to focus on the model's agreement, the number of breeding pairs, and I'll focus on the period where we have a little more data, so it's easier to gauge the fit of the model. So that's from the mid-1980s forward. Our model is in the red line here with the observed data in the dots. You can see it does a pretty good job of matching that over the general trend in a decline and then an increase in the number of breeding pairs. We found that there was a positive relationship between sea surface temperature during incubation and chick survival. Therefore, when sea surface temperatures were warmer, there tended to be greater chick survival. We also identified that the majority of the model estimated bycatch was allocated to the illegal demersal longline fishing fleet. This plot demonstrates that with the number of birds killed over time. Each different color represents a different fleet that we looked at. And this royal blue, which shoots up to almost 150 birds at one point, is the estimated bycatch for the illegal fleet. This peak in bycatch does temporally coincide with the observed decline in the number of breeding pairs. And you might notice that the absence of bycatch also coincides with the increase in the number of breeding pairs. And it's important to note that this virtual cessation of estimated bycatch for the illegal fleet, of course, relates directly to the assumed absence of the illegal fleet within this area after the mid-2000s. That assumed absence is due to increased surveillance and observations, which indicate that. And those increased observations and IUU deterrence was due to a French and Australian treaty, which went into effect in 2005 with the explicit purpose of reducing and removing this fleet's activity within the region. Digging a little bit deeper into the results, the majority of the estimated bycatch for the illegal fleet did occur around the breeding, around the colony, and it was during the breeding period, and it was the breeding birds. This temporal coincidence of the activity of the fleet as well as the birds that they're most aggregated and, frankly, they're most sensitive during the breeding period really resulted in a strong impact on this population. This model does assume that biparental care is necessary for the survival of a chick, as it takes a lot of time and energy to provide enough food for a chick to survive. Therefore, for every individual that was modeled as a breeding adult that was killed during the breeding season, the model also assumed that that bird's chick died as well. This suggests that the historical reduction of IUU effort was critical to the viability of this population, and fortunately this monitoring and surveillance is going to continue, and That tends to be pretty good news for these birds that were hit pretty hard by, are implicated as being hit quite hard by that fleet historically. This is the end of my formal presentation. Thank you very much for listening to how my co-authors and I have characterized the spatial use and interactions between fishers, fish, and albatross to hopefully understand some of the historical drivers of their spatial and demographic patterns. As you walk away and as we continue, I hope that you consider the importance of spatial ecology. We talked about fishers and how their unique behavior can be quantified, how it relates to classic ecological foraging ecology. And we've also identified some seasonal susceptibility of albatross relating to their life history as well as spatial ecology. Interactions can be complex. It's hard to quantify everything, and we pretty much sometimes need to make hard choices about what we invest in describing. But I think there are a lot of opportunities to build on information at hand, both data that exists as well as expertise that can be leveraged and turned into data. So thank you for listening, and here's my contact information if you want to reach out to me at some point later on.
I was wondering if you could kind of expound upon what sort of raw data is available or that you used for the IUU
Yes.
model. Like if it's unreported and illegal, where's it coming from? Yeah.
Yeah, very good question. Those data were essentially estimated by the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic and Marine Living Resources. The acronym is CAMLR, as well as some of their creators or some of their collaborators. The data that were developed were based on a variety of sources. Essentially, they're from three main sources. One, the illegal fishery heavily targeted one specific species. That's the Patagonian toothfish, and they have a very restricted spatial and temporal distribution. They're associated with particular bathymetric ranges and associated with bathymetric features, which is why the demersal longline is targeting them. So their spatial distribution was constrained, number one. Number two, there was a legal fishery active, and so they were able to use the catch rates for that legal fishery to start doing extrapolations for what might have been happening in the illegal fishery. And then they also intercepted a couple of illegal fishing vessels and were able to actually observe the catch that were on board, as well as identify some illegal vessels which they're occasionally unable to actually apprehend. The bycatch estimate for the illegal fleet, which went into the model, was based off of the observed legal fleet prior to the use of mitigation measures. So the illegal fleet initially didn't use mitigation measures as the magnitude of the impact wasn't really understood before they had started really exploring the fishery. Yeah, those are the main IUU data which came into play. Yeah.
So I was really interested in, you have this big chunk of time period where it seemed like through your modeling process, almost exclusively it was bycatch that was driving these demographic processes of the albatross. And so you didn't find any sort of competition of resources. You said you put some sort of density dependence in there to see if that was driving some of these demographic patterns, but then didn't touch much on it in the results.
Yeah, we used density dependence does appear to be impacting the survival of chicks and juvenile albatross. We didn't assess the potential impact of density dependence on adults. We looked at the younger life stages because we thought they would be more susceptible. So we did see evidence of those demographic feedbacks, but I think it'd be nice to look at the population for a little bit longer. And if I could show a little bit further back in data, but this population appeared, yeah, this doesn't really show it very well. The population appeared to be at what might be a carrying capacity. It appeared to be stable for quite a while, and then there was this plummet and the eventual rebound. And the population is now, with more data, beginning to approach what was the former, the previous level, which could be a carrying capacity for the region, but carrying capacity is also impacted by availability of other resources. And the first to admit that what their information is being gained on their diet, but understanding their diet composition and variability interannually is somewhat lacking right now. But it is an active field.
I thought it was really cool how the different flag states had discernible fishing strategies. So it was really neat to see. And what do you think drives those patterns? Like, have you ever, like looking at maybe like economic factors or population size that differentiates different strategies used by the flag states?
Well, historically, the kind of mantra about these two fleets are that the Japanese fleet targets southern bluefin tuna, and the Taiwanese fleet targets albacore. But what I've read in some kind of more socioeconomic literature is that is the case to a certain extent, but that the Taiwanese fleet does appear to be becoming increasingly flexible. And there are also other fleets that I wouldn't classify as pelagic longline fleets. They're called fresh longline fleets. And so they're smaller boats, which are even more capable of quickly adjusting their gear type. They don't stay out. They don't have as large of holds, and so they need to transfer their catch quite rapidly. But I think that there are a lot of changes that are occurring within the fishery, particularly within the last 15 years, that haven't been captured here. And the data that I modeled do stop in 2011, so they are slightly historical. But there are some very different economic factors going into the ability for people to buy or lease boats. And it appears that, last I read, the Taiwanese fleet might be going towards slightly smaller boats that are a little more nimble.
I was kind of curious, are the fishers themselves surprised to learn that their behavior can be modeled after ecological theory? Like, is that something that is communicated to them? And if so, are they kind of like, really, like, are they self-aware, I guess is the question I'm asking?
I have not actually interacted with any of these fishers. Okay. I have shared and communicated the results with the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, who manages these data, but I haven't interacted with any of the actual fishers, which is a little bit frustrating. Yeah, I'm really honored to be able to look at high seas fisheries, but it also makes it, for me, difficult to be engaged with the fisheries in the way that I'd ideally like to be able to.
Did you ever run into any issues with correlation between covariates? Because in the first one, I had surface temperature, as well as season, and I don't know enough about it, but I expect this to be slightly correlated.
Yes, they are cross-correlated, and when we selected individual temperature bands for sea surface temperature, we did try to pick bands that were representative of different ecological regions, which were minimally correlated together. But in terms of the simulated seasonal cycle and the sea surface temperature band, they were related, definitely. But we also were explicitly interested in seeing whether there was the regular-only seasonal cycle that they were most associated with, or whether there was the regional variation that it was more associated with. So there there's definitely some shared variability between the variables.
Well, I think with that, we'll wrap up. We're going to go to Nick's, I believe, after this for some drinks later. So I would encourage you all to stop by and join us, and you can ask Pam more questions. Let's all give her a round of applause.
I am probably driving. I mean, it's just because I live far, but I could buy it. I think I'll buy it. Yeah. Sometimes I bike, sometimes I drive. Oh, but my car's on there, so.
I'm going to fly across, but I'll see you over there.
Okay. I think there's a bunch of people leaving now.
Okay. I'll be. I'm going to fly for that. I'll fly for that.
Taiwanese fishers who are just like,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know, part of the Taiwanese
on
sea,
my
like I go down there,
mental
like,
list,
it,
I need to
it
write
really
it
could
down.
be almost anywhere.
I think the
Who else
flags
is
could
flowing?
be from
Just
anywhere,
Team
but it
Legend?
might
Flying on
be
notes so
particular
far.
nations.
Did you get a
I'm
ticket
not
from-
sure if it is
Are
particular,
they
like
upper? You are upper.
mostly captains
I don't
from
know,
a certain
Face
area
Amp,
that
yeah.
are like, yeah, let's go find a bunch of assholes and get us some illegal
It
tickets.
seems crazy to me that, you know, the predominant flag states in that area are like Japan and Taiwan. And it's not even like their ocean.
Oh, and the Korean fleet's gotten huge too. They're actually like the big
No, I
up
think
and
they were the
coming
only ones-
Japan kind of going.
I don't know if
It's
Sam
like it's
actually
not
had the hill
Australia,
or
it's
if
not
he
the
was just
French
yelling the
necessarily
hill.
that own Kerguelen. Like it's not South Africa. It's not
Yeah.
Mozambique.
Lighting?
It's these.
They're
See a
very
hit lighting?
peaceful on their water.
Yeah.
And then
It's
turn them all off.
interesting to like the seagoing pride nations or something. I don't know. I think there's
Those two?
history there that
Which
I
one's
don't,
two? You can turn
cultural
it off.
history that I don't appreciate that relates to it.
So these always stay on there. So yeah, this is how
Turn to main, and then this just stays in the
New
stream.
Zealanders and the Australians are pretty
yeah,
active in the South, in the Southern Ocean too.
They are,
so.
but in terms of magnitude,
I've just been
I don't
really,
think
I've been reading the like
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
thing that Sam sent
Yeah.
us to start it up every time.
That definitely wasn't
I
the
don't
right
think, I mean,
thing
there's
to
a huge
No,
market
it
opportunity.
wasn't.
to stop the
Korea and
presentation.
Japan.
Yeah, I don't know how he
I don't
did
Yeah.
it.
Massive
Did you
consumers
guys
of
know
tuna.
about the system?
Yeah.
As
We got it.
we are too.
Yeah, it was
They did a
like
good job talking
You did great.
in front of people.
You did
Oh
great.
my
Japan,
God, you're
Taiwan,
amazing.
Korea, China,
Were you?
Seychelles.
I was like, I couldn't tell.
And
You're like the most amazing
Spain.
public
That's
speaker.
the flag,
That like
that's the flag stuff.
Yep, they're in the
They,
top
they were
five
they were
that
some
I've
of the
ever
larger
seen.
fleets. I
Yeah.
think I'm forgetting
Yeah.
one more, but I looked at like 6 or 7 fleets.
I've been to
at
lots of
first, and I'm like,
conferences,
hell no.
I want to be smart when I grow
Yeah.
up like that.
But that flag state doesn't necessarily indicate the nationality that's running the
Not
ship
true.
or
Like
owns the ships or the company.
that
you know.
yeah. Exactly, like, the only place that isn't true that I understand, I know that with,
I'm
at
just
least
gonna go
used to
home
be
and
with
then I'll come
Japanese
back for the
fleets,
game.
if,
Yeah,
to
I
be a
really need to
Japanese
start
flying
hydrating. I need
vessel,
to
you
know.
have to have all Japanese captains or
Okay.
something.
Okay, yeah.
But then the deckhands,
The
you know,
deckies
the
come
crew
from
has to be, but the deckies can just be from,
Yeah, she'll be on the
I
other
didn't
side.
ignore you. I walked back and
yeah,
forth.
from,
So I'm studying Australia.
well, and I went right
Then I
into
sat
it
next
too.
to her.
I'm wearing my bunnies.
Back streets. That's
Trying
right.
to wear-
I don't
trying
want
to wear
to end up
representative
going out.
clothing.
Like I don't
Yeah.
need to
Got
go
a
twice.
Kerguelen
Kind of
conference
thing.
t-shirt that was from Hobart.
So that's what I did last
Do you
time.
know,
It was
it's
too much. To go to Nick's, be there for like an
I
hour and a
didn't know
half,
her
go
very
home,
well.
grab food,
Okay.
come to
I
the
got
game,
her
then go
into a
out
few
again
times.
after that. It was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
it's a lot.
Because
But
she's
yeah.
down on one of, I can't remember, she's on one of the islands.
So
She was on, I didn't actually get to go on any of the islands. I got to go to a research lab in rural France, which was very cool. And Hobart.
Yeah, well, Hobart is very cool.
Hobart's amazing.
Was it the CRNS that you were?
Yep.
Okay, I was wondering.
Yeah.
That place is like mythological in Seaburg.
Well,
I feel like.
and it's really interesting because it is really it is in very rural.
It's in Gizeh.
Very rural
Is
France.
it Gizeh?
Yeah. Beauvoir du Sud. Technically, more or less, something like that. I've been working on saying Kerguelen instead of Kerguelen.
I was gonna say the way it was written, I always kind of thought it was like
Well, some people, I don't know which one's right or wrong, but I try to do it the more French way,
yeah.
and I think that's Kerguelen.
So you met Henri Weimerscourge.
Yes,
Damn,
I have.
that's a elite company.
you show through the line.
Yeah, did you need a ride somewhere?
Like anywhere, yes.
Yeah, I can see you. I didn't park super close, but I can definitely drive
Are
you.
you going across the next? Are you guys going across? Or?
I think I'll go to Nick's.
Okay.
Are you going to Nick's?
Yeah, I
Okay.
can just come here.
Sounds good. What am I forgetting? Doesn't matter because
You're not leaving.
nothing I have of that much value.
You're gonna be at Clemson again on Monday.
I'm gonna be here tomorrow for GitHub. What?